Okay, Shalom Aleichem, everybody say. So today I wanted to talk about the sugya of Hatayra Chasam L'Menim She Yisrael and price gouging and boycotts uchadema. Now, partially some of this topic we've discussed in the past. I believe when we talked about Esregim by Corfu and etc. We've touched on certain themes that we're going to touch on today. But I just wanted to come at it from a shtickle different angle. So I just want to be makdim like this. In the 1800s, when Jews in larger numbers started coming to America for the first time, meaning before that there had been a smattering of Jews. There were some colonial Jews, in the colonial days of the United States. Primarily they were Southerners, Sfardim, and there are some very old American shuls, even in Virginia and etc. But by and large, Jews as a large segment of the population in America was not common until the mid-1800s. Now, in the mid-1800s, when Germany began to pivot towards tremendous intellectual emancipation and unification, when Germany started becoming more open-minded, and the Jews of Germany, as we know, followed very much along that track, reform, and from there Haskalah and to the rest of Europe, etc. So those Jews, those Reform Jews, were the first to immigrate to the United States in large numbers, and they set up shop in New York City and many other cities, and that's why the Reform Judaism was the largest segment of Judaism in America, probably through the 1950s and 60s, meaning till after the war, when much larger groups of religious, fiercely religious Jews came after the war. But these was the first groups, and they had no problem with settling into the American culture and the American society. They melted in very nicely, and many of these German Jews became very wealthy and very successful. A lot of the famous stores that were open in New York City, like department stores, were owned by these German Jews. Many major financial interests, banking, these Jews had a big impact on. I mean, these Jews who were not religious but came to the United States in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, did very well here. Now, later on in the 1880s, after the Russian government under the Tsars passed rules encouraging emigration, they had a goal of having a third of all the Jews under their territory emigrate, and the Tsar at that time, after the partition of Poland, controlled millions and millions of Jews who lived in the Pale of Settlement and etc. And the Tsar made it official government policy to be raised the Jews to the point of coercion, so that some of them should want to emigrate and move, and many millions took up that offer. And in the 2 decades, let's say from 1882 until 1902, probably 2 and change million Eastern European, Russian, Polish, Lithuanian Jews emigrated to the United States. Many of those Jews came to the United States. They were from or even from in the United States, but unfortunately many of their children and grandchildren were not able to stay. And this is a sugya farzich, what happened to the Jews of America in those days, and why, I guess, not having the proper infrastructure or schooling available for their children, their Yiddishkeit wasn't able to take hold. But in any case, they were, by and large, a large mass of extremely poor people. Very, very destitute population, this Eastern European population that emigrated to the United States. They lived primarily jammed into tenement houses in the Lower East Side. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people lived in a very, very small radius, jammed, sometimes a family to one room, sharing tenements, living in coal rooms in the basement. A crazy, poor, hard life. Many of them became peddlers and little shopkeepers, etc. And from there are many of the families that eventually stayed and became successful, etc. And these are families that built up the Jewish population in the United States. Now, during that time, in the late 1800s, was also the time of the robber barons. If you know American history, it was known as the Gilded Age. It was when several, very powerful businessmen, industry leaders and businessmen were consolidating tens of companies under their control, railroads and oil and etc. And until the election of Theodore Roosevelt, who campaigned and focused on breaking up trusts and monopolies, and then he turned the attention of the Justice Department, and that brought the end of the robber baron era. Now, what's interesting is that one of the industries that were controlled by robber barons of a sort were the Bichlal, the meatpacking industry, but in particular the kosher Jewish meatpacking industry. The meatpacking district in New York City it's still called that today, had 5 or 6 large Jewish concerns. They were owned by primarily these German Jewish families who had long been assimilated. That was part of the issue, and they owned the meat dressing business. I think it could be called. The cattle were not raised in New York City, because to raise cattle in New York City is expensive and inefficient. The area is not well suited for grazing cattle, so the cattle are raised in the Midwest, where the terrain and the agriculture allows you to raise them easily and for cheaper. They're usually killed somewhere out there in the Midwest, and then they're shipped by train to New York City, where they arrive at the dressers, it was called. Now, the dressers would carve this meat up into various cuts, cuts of beef that could be sold at different prices, and then there was a network of hundreds of little butcher shops throughout the Lower East Side, maybe somewhere between 200 or 300 butcher shops at that time in the Lower East Side. Now, during this era, kosher meat began to get very expensive. I believe, if I'm correct, chicken was not really a thing yet. The mass production and the chicken as a staple, I think, was not so common. Chicken was more expensive back then. I think chicken only became like the cheaper, easier variety of meat to eat in the United States maybe in the 1950s or 60s. I could be wrong about that. And this large network of butcher shops, the prices were creeping up. Now, people felt, and probably correctly, later on there was a lawsuit by the Justice Department, and these people were fined, so there's probably some validity to the taina, that there was like a cabal of sorts. The kosher meat dressers, these meatpacking industry people, were conspiring with each other to raise the price of kosher meat on all the consumers. Now, they tried desperately to fight back. The butchers made a boycott. They shut down their shops for a week, but they didn't have the ability to actually stop it. They were too dependent on these larger, concerns that they couldn't really fight with them, and they weren't able to get anywhere. Now, in 1902, there was something called the kosher meat boycott. It was led by women. Several women, 2 women in particular, 2 famous women in particular, whose names escape me this minute, but they gathered together hundreds of women in a hall on the Lower East Side, and they convinced them that the women have the ability to stop this price gouging that's going on, and they're gonna bring the prices down to where it needs to be. They gathered together, and they decided to divvy it up. They sent 5 people to each block, 5 women to each block, and they would stand on the block, and anyone who was coming to purchase meat that day during the days of the boycott, they would, convince them and talk to them and try to convince them not to purchase meat from the butchers to enforce the boycott. Now, ultimately, the boycott got out of control. Oh, I see. I wrote it down. The women, the famous ones, was Fanny Levy and Sarah Adelson. Interestingly, if you look at the newspapers of the day, and there was a book that someone published with this, we see the pictures from the boycotts and the pictures of the cases afterwards. Many of these women look very frum, with covered hair. Some of them even wearing shaitels. Some of them look like babushkas, like Russian babushkas. But they're a large contingent of ferocious and frum Russian or Eastern European women, and obviously this protest spilled out of control, and they started assaulting shoppers and butchers and destroying people's stock and etc. Several of them were arrested. There were several court cases about them. Some of them got $5 fines. Some of them got $10 fines. And the newspaper descriptions of the day are very entertaining to read. Some newspapers were pro, some were against. The New York Times, for example, which was then more or less a local Jewish paper, ran it in an extremely negative light. The Forward, which was a Yiddish paper, endorsed it, gave them a lot of credit for it. The Tribune said its own thing. Each one of the New York Herald, every one of the New York papers of the day, some still existing, some not existing, wrote their take on the situation. And the truth is that it had some sort of impact, and these women were able to bring the large and seemingly all-powerful meatpacking business, down to its knees and force them to come to the table. Now, there was court cases involved, etc. also. Now, the point of why I'm mentioning this story is because it highlights a boycott in order to avoid steep prices. And I wanted to handle call it the sugya of not wasting money, meaning of being frugal and not wasting money, and the sugya of using the tools of a boycott in order to ensure that someone else doesn't force you to waste your money. Now, why was I thinking about it this week? Because the pasuk in this week's parsha, it tells us about the neged tzaras that happens to Abayis, and the pasuk tells us, it's in Perek Yudal pasuk Lamed Vav, it says V'tziva hakayin upino es Abayis, B'terem Yavei HaKohen Liris as a Negev Le'itame Kol Asher B'bayis. Achich Yavei HaKohen Liris as Bayis. Pasuk tells us, and this is a bakanta thing, everybody knows this halacha, that before the Kohen comes to look at the Negev of the house and potentially pass judgment on it and say that the house is Tameh, and thereby everything inside of it would become Tameh too, meaning once the Kohen condemns the house is condemned with all of its contents. So the Kohen instructs that before he's going to come take a look at it, they should remove all their possessions from the house, so that their possessions shouldn't needlessly need to be condemned and what do you call it and destroyed. So now this is what the pasuk says, and the Mishnah in Negaim really says like this. It says Ketzad Re'iyas Habayis. It's a Mishnah Negaim Perkid Beis. It says Ketzad Re'iyas Habayis Uba Asher Lo Habayis V'Higid L'Koyin. Someone who has a neg in his house will come to see his house and will come to the Koyin. V'tziva HaKoyin Epinas Habayis. V'afilu Chavili Eitzev V'afilu Chavili Kanim Divrei B'Yehuda. Shimon Omer Eisik U'Lefinoi Omer Meir V'Chimam V'Tamaloi. Rameir asks, what's really going to become tamei in the house? Imtimer Kli Eitzev. You can tell me his wood kalim is going to become tamei. Ubegadav u'matchiyosav and his metal kalim and his clothing. Matvilin vein tahirim. We can tell them in the mikvah and their tar. So al machasa Torah. What's the Torah concerned about over here? Al Kli Charsai on his little earthenware kalim. Imkein chasa Torah al mamayne habazoi kavchayner al mamayne achav. Says the Mishnah, and the Mishnah makes this like this exclamation point on this din. If the Torah was so chas, so cautious not to waste, Yiddish geld, for sure on Mamayne Achav the Torah is going to be makud. And Imkain al Mamayne Kavachemer al Nefesh Banav of B'naisev. If the Torah is so concerned about his money, for sure the Torah is going to be concerned about Nefesh Banav of B'naisev. Imkain shal Rasha Kavachemer al Shal Tzadik. And if the Torah is concerned about a Rasha's money, for sure the Torah will be concerned about a Tzadik's money. This is how the Mishnah ends off. Now, and Rashi Taka in Masechtas Rosh Hashanah, the Chav Zayin and Aleph, and in Chulin and Testament and Beis, Rashi, when he brings down the side of Atayr Chasam Manim Yisrael, says Mikan Lamdu that Atayr Chasam Manim Yisrael from this pasuk. From this pasuk that says Upina Sabayis V'Tzivas HaKayim, which is really essentially a Mefurish Mishnah in Negaim that Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael, on a very high level. Now the problem is, and this is something that was observed by many Gedolei Yisrael, the Shagasari, the Nedi Behuda, B'Shaya Pik, many Gedolei Olam, the Bikiyim were Omer on this and Shtal Zach on this Nakud. The problem is that the Gemara Menachos brings a different makar. The Gemara says, "Ma'im bnei achisain, ma'im bnei achischain, Amar v'Lazar, Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael." Heicher Remiza. The Gemara here brings a makar. What's the makar that Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael? Says the Gemara, "V'hishkisa se'edav esbirim." From the pasuk of V'hishkisa se'edav esbirim. Now the pasuk of V'hishkisa esbirim edav esbirim is referring to when Hakadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, "V'dibartan al asela," you should talk to the cellar and you should bring out water. And eventually we know how that story goes. So Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, you'll bring out water, v'eshkisa se'edav esbirim, you give the nation and their animals to drink. And from there, the Gemara in Menachos learns out that Vaistois Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael, because normally the derech is to be b'mayit b'nisim. We don't, a nest is supposed to be as minimal as possible. And nisim are not supposed to be, very grand. And still, HaKadosh Baruch over here is saying, I'm going to make a nest that's going to provide enough water, enough sustenance for v'shkisa as Klal Yisrael, v'esbirim, and also their cattle. Why? Because Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael, Hashem didn't want their cattle to go to waste, their cattle to go in the garbage. So you see from here, says the Gemara Menachos, that the Torah is very chas on Manim Yisrael. Now the problem is, and the Turi Even and Rosh Hashanah and Arth and Chav Zayin, and the Nedi Behuda and the famous Tshuva addresses this point. It says, what's going on? Why does the Gemara bring two different makaris? Rashi's bringing from a Mishnah in Negaim, which is a raya Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael, and the Gemara Menachos is bringing a totally different makar from a pasuk Ben Bidbar v'Hishkisa that Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael. So I saw the Turi Even in Rosh Hashanah. He says the teretz. He writes as follows: says the afshir of Meir Omer came by Mishnah. Harei l'shitas Rabbi Yehuda v'Reb Shimon tzarach l'fanas af chavili eitzim she'enim mekabel tumah. He says if you looked in that Mishnah in the Gam, which we read through quickly, there are things in there that are not mekabel tumah b'chlal. So clearly, it's not because they're going to become tamei. Some man the amrim in the Mishnah that din can't because of Atayr Chasam Manim Yisrael. So according to those man the amrim in the Mishnah, the Gemara Menachos wants to have another makar. Mishum kach amr b'Menachos yalfina lam v'ishkisa v'se'edav v'esbiram. That's Azayzak the Turi Even v'divrei Rashi einam ela libuder Meir. And Rashi in Rosh Hashanah is bringing the makar from Parshas Tazria Mitzayra, from Parshas Mitzayra. That's only according to Meir, but according to Yehuda and Reb Shimon, you need the other makar. That's why there's two makaris. Now the Nedi Behuda in Yeridei Tanyana and Simon Kof Samach, he has a conversation. Now the Nedi Behuda has a few conversations with this shayil. Almost always, if my memory is correct, about inyanim that are not negei halacha l'maisa, and oftentimes the Nedbuda, prefaces with on those shilas that he doesn't really like to answer shilas that are not halacha l'maisa. Kaidu the Nedbuda was an active and busy Rav. He was not a hypothetical theorist, but the Nedbuda writes as follows. It's a tshuva in Simon Kuf Samach. It's written to Rabbi Shaya Pick Berlin, who was one of the famous Bekiyim and Goinim of the era. He's a contributor to the Maseres Hashas and the Mishpat that we have on the side of the Gemara. I don't think he's the first one to start writing it. I think possibly Bishua Boyaz is, but he's definitely a contributor. And the Nedbuda writes as follows: Shlama Rabba Legaver Rabba, Marganisa Tava, Baki Bekulu Talmuda, Bavli Yerushalmi Sefri, Taisefta, Betaisefes Meruba, Hukvayda Huvi Yedidi Chavivi Rav Ma'ar Hagoyna Amushlam Oid B'Torah B'Masam Tevim Foin B'Revenu Yeshaya Nir Yar B'Kilik Desha Breslau. Now, the Nedbuda is writing to me, see, with great honorifics and title as befitting a goyin of his stature. And he says, "Here b'mechtav b'koshi setzumas." You asked many, hard-hitting questions. I'll try a little bit to answer what I could. And then he brings as follows. He says, you brought this shaila about, it's choppy, I won't read the whole thing, but he says, you brought the shaila about the Tumah Kairis. How come Rashi brings one, and the Gemara Menachos seems to say another? He says, V'amnam l'daiti hakol nachan. He says, Devade raya zu, the veshkisa alam tvei. The makar from veshkisas be'eram, that Hashem made a nest to provide sustenance for Klal Yisrael's animals, even though we try to be ma'it b'nisim. That's ultimately the bigger and better makar. The madik siv etziva hakayin apinu sham, ein ze chiddush din. The lama la yachos, ma hefsed yesh b'zeh. Meaning this that it says to take out the kalim from the house before the kalim comes in metamim. No big deal. Why shouldn't you take out the kalim? There's no din that random, collateral damage kalim in the house have to stay there and become tamei. You might as well take them out. It doesn't cost anybody anything to do it. But he says, the water that came out of the rock, that was mamish something ashina ateva, some sort of crazy change to nature. Generally, the posture of nisim always is l'mayit b'nisa adav. Hashem's not trying to make the most grand nisim. The most appropriate and least amount is the best. It would have been alone enough to do a nest that water should come out of tzarech eidah. So that Klal Yisrael shouldn't die of thirst. And still Hashem made sure to do an extra nace that there should be enough water for the Be'irim also. There you see take a chasam mammon Yisrael. Last is a feel nes yaitz min ateva lahatzam mammon shalem. Abel l'maisav says v'amnam min veshkisi yesh raya shechasek hakadosh baruch hu shel Klal Yisrael. He says, but there's a problem. From the pasuk of Veshkisas Be'erim, you just see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares to salvage and to save the whole, financial interest of Gans Klal Yisrael. Shesham ha'birim shekol Yisrael. That was all of Klal Yisrael together who was struggling. L'chein am v'eshkisa v'es be'irim. But how do you know that an individual, just one single individual, yachid? For that, you need the other makar of upinas abayis. So Meil says the Nedbuda, there's two different kilu trichasas. Of course, he says the better makar is the Gemara Menachos, which is more conclusive, and it involves doing a nest and etc. But you want to know that even an individual's money is worth standing on, is worth saving. That from the pasuk by Mitzayra and the Mishnah and the Gam that says that we take the kelim out. Now, this is not something that I'm very familiar with, so I'll just briefly mention that in some of the Chassidish Svarim they handle what's takab shat at Chasam Menim Yisrael, and I think it could be it's a Naim Elimelech that explains that I would have to find it again. It could be it's a Naim Elimelech that explains that you see, he says that certain people have a certain connection to certain assets, certain objects that they own. They feel somehow connected to their stuff. And he says Vaistais that there's a reason why every person owns what they own. Like a person's physical possessions are not just they're nothing like as if Chassidim sagen ayid's gashmis is ruchnius. Meaning everybody that a person owns, everything that a person owns is for a reason, for a tzarech. There's something that it fits in, me'eza, tifatam shiyah, and meila tarich chasam manim sheyisrael, because they're not supposed to lose it. But this is not, it's a tidbit. Now, in any case, so this is the basic underlying principle that there's a concept called Atayr Chasam Manim Sheyisrael. Now, the truth is that Atayr Chasam Manim Sheyisrael even plays a role lahalacha. And that's kaidua. We talked about this once before, but just briefly, Rabbeinu Tam and Sefer Hayasher and the Chelik HaTshuvas and Simon Beis, he brings that if there's a day yichida, he says vals, but b'makim rabim the behefsid meruba Yesh lismech al das miyut lahakel after yachad v'rab malachik rabim. Why is that? Says Rabbeinu Tam. Because Atayr Chasam Manim Yisrael. Meaning, b'makam hefsid, you could be semech on a day yechida, or the paiskim could be semech on a day yechida, even connected rabbim. Similarly, the Trumas Hadeshin and Simon Reish Dalid. He also mentions Atayr Chasam Manim Yisrael l'gabe psak. Meaning, so the paiskim, the early paiskim, the Rishonim, already are incorporating this idea of Atayr Chasam Manim Yisrael into halacha. Now, the truth is that today, to anybody who's learned halacha, or b'chlal, everybody knows this. This is common knowledge already. Everybody knows that Hefsid Meruba, Tzarech Rabim, Hefsid Rabim. There's many times Shasat Chak, all these type of things where today we're very familiar with that play a role in halacha. And the truth is that until the Ramah's days, when the Ramah was writing his Teres Chatas, before he wrote his Hagayos on Shulchan Aruch, when the Ramah was writing his Teres Chatas, which is Dinam on Nisav Heter, the Ramah incorporated in a systematized and thorough way all of these different stadim lahakal, b'shasat chak, b'shem hefsid, and etc. And this we've talked about in the past. I'm not going to go into in detail, but the Maral, I think, had an older brother, Reb Chaim Achia Maral. Today, most people I think only know of him from the drush for a siyum that's on the side of the Izvah Gemara. It's like a pretty standard insertion in the Gemara. But he wrote many other svarim, Sefer Chaim and Agada, and a few different svarim. He wrote an interesting sefer while he was running away for a pandemic. We've talked about him in the past several times, but he has a sefer called Vikuach Mayim Chaim, which is a sefer brimming with vitriol to argue strongly against the Ramah's Teres Chatas. And one of the primary tainis that the Vikuach Mayim Chaim, Rav Chaim Achia Maral, has on the Ramah is that the Ramah institutionalized and systematized these kulas of Shasat Chak. And Rav Chaim said, of course I'm aware that the Ramah didn't invent them from whole cloth, and that there's many examples in the Rishonim discussing, Shasat Chak Shani because of Atayr Chasam Manim Yisrael and taking it seriously, but to systematize it and to make it so available that every Halbam Aretz could open a Shulchan, could open a Teres Chatas and paskin for himself, and ask the Vikuach Mayim Chaim is an extensive, and then he goes on to bring many rayos of things that he holds that the Ramah made an error on. Now, I think we know who won, because the Ramah became Bnei Yisrael Yotzim Biyad Ramah, and Gans Klal Yisrael's Nishan on Piskei Ramah, Sayin Teres Chatas, and Sayin the Mappa, and Sayin Darkei Moshe, etc. But in that time and place, I believe Rav Chaim was older than the Ramah. It was far from a given that the Ramah would, his Mahalach Psak of institutionalizing this Shasat Chak and Terech Chasam Manim Yisrael into halacha would be successful. Now, what's interesting, Stam, and we've talked about this, I'm not going to sample it now, but the Vikuach Mayim Chaim was published once, early. I think it was published like 3 times in its whole career. It's a 500-year-old sefer, and it was published 3 times, which tells you that it's not, it didn't really have an impact. Now, the second time that it was published, I think it was published under the auspices of the Shalom Eish of Yosef Shalom Natanzin, who was an Einikel of the Ramah, and who he wrote a sefer, like a trailing pirush. I forgot what he called it. It was like a trailing pirush that he wrote on the Vikuach Mayim Chaim to answer up. I think he called it Teres Moshe, maybe like a trailing pirush to answer. Because I think the Ramah sefer that the Vikuach Mayim Chaim was Be'er arguing was Teres Chatas. I think the Shalom Eish added like Hagayos Teres Moshe to explain why the Teres Chatas was right from all the Vikuach Mayim Chaim's tainus. Now, what's interesting is that the most intense part of Rav Chaim Achia Maral's critique of the Ramah is in the Hakdama to the Vikuach Mayim Chaim, and the Shalom Eish writes that in his little Hakdama to the Sefer, he writes that I prepared an extensive rebuttal to the Hakdama of the Vikuach Mayim Chaim, but then I decided, let bygones be bygones, and I won't print his or mine. So in the second edition of Vikuach Mayim Chaim, it just jumps right into the weeds of the disputes in these particular sugyas. It's not an exciting read. Meaning you lose all the storytelling in there, because the Shalom Eish on purposefully took out the Hakdama of the Vikuach Mayim Chaim and his own Hakdama, meaning to take out all the tabloid stuff in there and to just leave it as a stripped down halachic text. But in any case, that's another example of Hatayr Chasam Manim Yisrael making it into psak in an institutional level, and the pushback that it engendered. Now, I saw Reb Asher Weiss in a tshuva and in Minchas Asher Al Torah. He has a whole siman what do you call it, on Hefsid Meruba, Safek Deraisa, Safek Derabanan, like the rules of how Hefsid Meruba, how much Hefsid Meruba is, and it's very Talmud Chachamdik, meaning you have to have a broad. There's many examples throughout the Neisei Kalim, in the Ramon and the Shach and the Taz and Magen Avram, and later Poskim, and you have to have a very broad base of knowledge to figure out exactly what's considered Shasat Chak, what's considered Hefsid Meruba. He goes through the Chazanishes and Ramoshes and etc. And if someone sees it's in Parshas Tazria or Mitzera, a very nice collection of how that works. Now, in any case, I just wanted to circle back to the boycott issue. So now this is something that additionally we spoke about in the past a little bit, but that would be remiss if I didn't mention it now, is ultimately the real shaila of a financial boycott in order to get a better result in the market. If that's an acceptable, angle to take, really comes from the Tzemach Tzedek. Now, this is the Tzemach Tzedek Harishon, the Kadmon, in Rachaman L'Krachmal, not the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And in Shaila Chavchas, he has a Shaila as follows, and I'll just go through it quickly. He says, Pamachas, Hayu Harelim Meichre Dagim Miyakar Mashar, Visharo Shayehudim Kainim L'Chvayt Shabbos, Ve'in Menichem B'Shvel HaYoker. They saw that Jews were purchasing fish for Shabbos, and the fact that the fish was expensive wouldn't stop them. And the Kahal made a rule that no one should buy fish for 2 months to teach these fishmongers a lesson, then force the prices to come down. And Talmidim asked me if this is an appropriate thing that they could do. Given the Kavat Shabbasu. This is something that we should talk about one day. Stam, what this Indian is of Haitzah Shabbos Yom Tov, meaning until where? Could you buy $1,000 bottle of wine? Could you buy a whole side of a cow? Meaning, is there a limit? Where's the limiting principle of Haitzah Shabbos Yom Tov? But maybe we'll save it for a different day. But in any case, this shaila that the Tzemach Tzedek is addressing, he says, Shaila, is this correct? He says, first of all, it's a begin Kavat Shabbos. Lamaisi, you're withholding from fish. Dagam on Shabbos is a big Indian. We should talk about that also one day. And you're holding back from that. And maybe it's a Chasaron and Amunas. It says the Tzemach Tzedek, and this is like the raya that really starts the conversation. He says, Tshuva, Yira the Shaper Dami Lemevet Kach. It's fine to do this. Mehad Yisib Masnisa and Seif Perak Aleph the Krisos. There's a famous Mishnah in the end in Krisos and Davches that says as follows. Maisa, there was a story, Sha'amdu Kinim b'Yerushalayim b'din Rezav. Kinim got terribly inflated. Now, in Yerushalayim, Taka has to do with Parshas Tazria Mitzvah as well. Kinim are a very necessary part of the Karbanis. Birds, sets of birds, pairs of birds, sometimes more than a pair, are needed to be brought for many different Karbanis. Now, so Kinim was a big market. Birds was a big market in Yerushalayim. It says one time the inflation reached such staggering peaks that they became B'din Rezav. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says he took leadership. He steps up. He says, I promise, Lashon Shvua, le'olin halayla, I won't sleep tonight, achiyu b'dinarin. Now this is Achrayas. He says, I promise you, what I'm going to do, I'm going to crash the market. I'm going to bottom out this market by tonight. I won't sleep tonight before I bottom out the market. It's nichnas lebezdin v'limeid, ha'isha sheyesh aleh chamisha leidis v'adayis, chamisha zavis v'adayis, mevi'in karban achas. And in 1 minute, he took what used to be an obligation for 5 karbanos and turned it into 1 carbon. And Kinim dropped by a quarter of the price. They become a quarter of the price. So Reb Shimon Gamliel, by changing the halacha and diminishing the amount of karbanos that people had to bring, he turned around the whole halacha and he mamish brought it to its ground. And Rashi explains over there, Rashi says the reason was, even though it's divrei Torah, even though there's a chiyuvim deraisa, he felt this was the right thing to do, because if not, people are going to stop bringing kinim b'chlal, and it's going to be a problem. So says Menachem in the Krach, very of a raya. He says, Kol sheken knias dagim, the einel l'chvayt Shabbos. It's not a deraisa to eat fish on Shabbos. It's only b'shem kavet Shabbos. After the kavet Shabbos, nami deraisa. The chsiv across on the Shabbos einig. Still, hakom whatever. Still says he, to use fish itself is not. It's not the only way. You could be mechabit Shabbos in other ways. Maybe it's not as good as fish. And Mameli says you could do it with other ways, and it's possible. Now he brings a Torah and some Rishon Beis, and Takan Rishon Beis, the Magen Avram, and the Mishabura, and others bring down this Tzemach Tzedek to tell you that we paskin like this, that if there's a need to boycott something in order to bring down the prices, even if it's karoch in some sort of diminution in Einik Shabbos or Kavet Shabbos, still we're able to do it. Now many poskim later on, the Chasam Sofer and Tshuva and the Chida and other poskim discuss this Tzemach Tzedek. It's like one of these famous tshuvas that everyone likes to talk about, and the Chasam Sofer argues on his raya from the Gemara and Kinim, and the Chida also does, and the Beis Hillel and Yeridei and the Chazdarim. The Beis Hillel famously says that eating fish on Shabbos is a deiraisa, We'll save that for when we talk about the Indian of eating fish on Shabbos. But it's a shmooze. But in any case, many argue on the Tzemach Tzedek, but almost none of them argue on the Tzemach Tzedek's psak. Meaning the Chassam Sofer in his Tshuva and the Chidah, when he discusses it, and I think even the Beis Hillel, Be'etzem agree with the Tzemach Tzedek in principle that boycotting is an acceptable measure to bring down the prices. They just, are nitpicking on the riots, whatever. Now, other places can talk about what about if the sellers of the fish are Jewish or some intermediary is Jewish or using a Jewish liach to buy it, and I'm not going to go into all of that in detail now. I just want to highlight this because this is another strong example of how the concept of Hatayr Chasam Menim Yisrael plays a role in halacha. So, although I don't think that the women in 1902 who boycotted the kosher meat in New York City asked Rabbanim, I think they were more like labor activists and stuff like that, and I think several of their children who were not religious at all actually went on to become major figures in the labor movement in New York City and unionizing and etc. The garment district, meaning when they were done with the meatpacking district, they moved on to the garment district and other districts. But B'chalev and Shia, had they come to a Rav to ask their shaila, this is l'chayra the sugya that would have served as the format for the Rav to discuss it. And I just think it's interesting discussion in the halach, the actual real world halachic impact of the concept of Hatayr Chasam Menim Yisrael. Okay, Yashikayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.